This is session 2 of the Level 1 Core Principles class. Our theme tonight is stances and transitions. What is a stance anyways? In Chinese martial arts, most of the styles focus on the idea of stance, set structures through which that particular martial arts ideas, applications, internal energy work. These are the physical forms through which these elements are mediated. What is a stance? A stance is a configuration within the legs that allows us to express different kinds of forces, different kinds of power, and different kinds of movement. In Chinese, the word for this is bu. For example, the so-called horse stance is called ma bu. The bow stance is called gong bu. The empty stance is called shu bu. These are particular kind of configurations that allow us to either express power or make transition. Not all martial arts styles are built from stance concepts. Pretty well any martial arts style will concentrate on the way movement occurs in the legs, but that's not always thought of in terms of stance, or not to the same extent, say, for example, as it is thought of in Chinese martial arts. In Tai Chi, we could go out on a limb and say the entire theory of the art depends on good stance work, or that it's not possible to practice Tai Chi in the way it is intended, or in the way it was intended by the past masters, if we don't have good and clear stance work. In boxing, or maybe in mixed martial arts, for example, they have leg work, but they don't have this idea of being in a fixed place. So we have in Chinese martial arts the idea we move from this stance to this stance. In Tai Chi, we're flowing from one stance to the other. We must have a fundamental understanding of how stances are proportioned. It doesn't really make sense to study stances that are impossible for the body to achieve in spontaneous situations. We often have the idea of long, extended stances. We see this in martial arts all the time, these very long, extended stances. You move from one to the other. That's totally fine. It's great leg training. It really helps you coordinate your power. The problem is, when you go from one position to the other, you can't maintain that. The stance should be in proportion to the bend of the weighted leg and the length of the leg that's stepping or extending out into the stance. If I have, for example, a medium-high stance here, I've just bent my legs a little bit, and I go to make a step, and I step way out here, I'm stepping beyond the proportion of my legs here. I'm only a little bit bent, but I've taken a gigantic step. If I want to take a bigger step, I have to earn it. I need to come a little deeper down into this leg. I have to be able to sustain the step and step to the length of the leg. When I'm in my stance, whatever kind of stance it is, that stance is proportioned. There's a couple ways I could create an incorrectly proportioned stance. One way is that I simply throw myself forward into the step, fall into the step. If I do something like this, then I have a stance that's long, it's quite big, but it's actually not in proportion to what I can sustain. Conversely, we could have the problem of having a nice deep bend here, but I step shy of where the leg can go. So I'm here, for example, and when I step, I should be able to extend all the way to the length of this leg. But instead of doing that, I just take a little step here. So it's like I'm bending and then I'm taking little teeny steps. That's also incorrectly proportion stance. Things that have to do with movement in martial arts, there's all kind of ways you can move. There's all kind of variations, and just like a painter will abstract the basic rules of color and shape and perspective, we can play in sort of abstract ways with the stepping and the stance proportion. That's all possible once we know how to paint. A painter will learn about the primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, and learn how to work with those before going into more experimental realms. Same thing here. We want to learn how to create a stance based on the actual structure and shape of the body. We don't want to take deep stances with snubby steps, and we don't want to stand high and fall into steps. We don't want to make those kind of errors. What I'm doing is settling into this leg as far as I can comfortably go. And then when I step out, in whichever direction I step out, extend the leg essentially to its length. I don't really want to lock the leg in a stiff, rigid kind of way, but I do want to take it basically to its length. When I settle into this structure, I will have a proportioned stance. This is going to be our measuring device for whether we're in a proportioned stance or not. How we get into a stance is we gradually move, we extend out from the weighted leg, the other leg, the stepping leg, and then we settle bit by bit into that leg. If I do what we call a horse stance, so my weight is on my right leg here, my left foot is in here. When I step out and I step out into the horse stance, I extend this leg to its length, find where the heel touches the ground. We're going to measure this length of the leg too, by the way, from the heel, not from the toe. So it's not the length of the leg plus the toes, it's the length of the leg up to the heels. So what we want to do is we want to sink into the joint here. I want to release, find my way into the center with the two hip joints relaxed. Now I'm in my stance. In this case, we're in the first of what we could call primary stances, the first of the natural stances. The natural stances are the ones where we've got 2 feet on the ground. So like the horse stance, the bow stance, the different widths of bow stance, and so on. These are the primary stances. We're going to work with 2 basic primary stances today to give us the idea here. When we're extending out and settling into the primary stance, what we want to do is be able to relax in the hip structure. When I move to the other side of the stance, driving over to this side of the stance, I'm folding in the hip. Now this is a concept that doesn't have an exact name in traditional Tai Chi. This is usually described in sort of metaphorical ways, roundabout ways. But the language that I use, the language that we use for this movement from one side of the stance to the other is the hip track. What we're looking at with the hip track is this way of moving from one extreme end of the stance through the center of the stance to the other extreme end of the stance. When I step out, I'm in a position that is not unlike if I had pushed my way to the extreme end of the stance. As I step out here, heel, step, down we come. The hip joint here is going to release. And when it releases, we'll find our way to the center of the stance. One way to do this is to start on one leg stepping out. Relax and find our way to the center of the stance. From here now, we can continue on and drive to the other end of the stance. When I come back, I find my way to center. And when I get to this side, I'm in the other extreme end. In our last class, we looked at the idea that when we sink down from the standing position, soles of the feet, ankles, knees, and hips relax, and we let the weight of the upper body start pressuring us down, down, down. We allow the ankles, knees, and hips to bend in equal proportion to one another. Down we go, sinking, sinking, down we go. When we stood up, I pushed down into the ground, and pushing with the 2 feet down into the ground, through the relaxed joints, and this is causing me to stand up. When we release, we sink down because the joints are relaxed and receiving the weight of the upper body. But when we stand up, it's like we're pushing these 2 swords into the ground, and they're causing us to stand up. We're being caused to stand. So we remember this from our basics of rising and sinking. When we do this movement of shifting from one side to the other, it's exactly the same thing. But notice we just have 1 sword, so it's not going to cause us to push down because this side isn't doing anything. When we push with only 1 leg, it causes us to move to this side. This is, in my view, exactly where people start going wrong in their Tai Chi. It's exactly at this moment. If we learn the lesson from last time, how to sink down and how to stand up, then we can apply that same concept here. When I'm pushing this leg, it's exactly as if I was standing up by pushing down into the ground. The only difference is I'm only pushing 1 leg. If I push only 1 leg, but I maintain relaxation in the hip joint, it should be that the pressure of this leg pushing pushes into the relaxed hip joint, and because the hip joint is relaxed, rotation will start to occur. Remember in our very first lesson last time, we talked about the different types of joints. We have the hinge joint in the knees, but we have a ball and socket joint in the hip. So if this is pushing into the ground, and this is pushing against a ball and socket joint, it should be that the ball and socket have the effect of causing rotation. If this joint is relaxed and I push exactly like I was pushing to stand up, but only with 1 leg, then this joint should give way and it should rotate. I'm going to show some variations on this. Observe what's happening here, and does it look correct to you or does it not look correct to you? So here's an example. Does that look correct? We're swaying to the side. It looks correct in that this leg is pushing me off to the side, but the hip is locked, and so it's causing me to maintain a straightforward orientation here. Look at the stick here. If I push down into the ground and I'm relaxed in the hip joint, watch what happens to the stick in terms of its orientation towards the camera. When I push, you see the stick starts to rotate following the hip joint. The stick is now on almost a 45-degree angle here. When I come back, of course, to the center, it's quite straight. So this is hip rotation. If I do this, we can see something's not right. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and call that a mistake. If a person tends to want to move that way in the legs, if that's how they want to move in the hips, then I would go so far as to say none of the rest of the Tai Chi can be done correctly. No posture can be done correctly. No form can be done correctly. No push hands drill, no sword exercise can be done correctly if the hip is swaying to the side rather than rotating in the socket. This one's going to be even worse. Here I am, I'm driving in the leg, but somehow I'm going like this. This is going even further than just not rotating. This is actually rotating in the other direction. This is not only, in my view, an error, this is a dangerous error. Because what happens here is when I drive across and I start to turn here, first of all, I'm not rotating in the hip at all, rotating in my ankle down here. Now remember we talked about what the joints do, that some of the joints glide, some of the joints incline, hinge joints, and some of them rotate like a ball and socket. When we talked about the ankles and the wrists, we said that we have gliding joints. And the joints have the ability to act like a hinge, but they also have a bit of a ball and socket quality too, or they have, let's say, the ability to rotate. You can see, though, that this is not really an ideal way of moving the ankle. But worse is, look what's going on in the knee. This is really a problem, because the knee is a hinge joint. It wants to do this. It doesn't want to be torqued. When I take the full weight of my body down into the legs, and I start driving across and I turn this way, what I'm doing is I'm putting all of this pressure right on the inside of the knee here. I don't even like demonstrating it. When I turn here, if I put tension in here, not only am I not rotating the hip, I'm putting stress on the knee, and the thigh is misaligned with the leg. So notice one characteristic of my correct rotation in the hip. If I drive across and this hip is relaxed and I rotate and I settle in here, you can see that there's a line between my hip, my knee, and my foot. Those things are all in a line. The usual instruction is don't let the knee go over the toe. That's one of the first instructions that people get when they learn Tai Chi and they start to think about stance. And that's a good guideline. That's a good basic guideline. Don't let the knee go over the toe. But the issue here is not that the knee is over the toe and for some reason that's bad. The issue is that the knee, when we're here, is not energetically aligned between the hip and the ankle. It's kind of poking out here. And so the leg is not supporting the rest of the body. When the knee comes back to its place between the ankle and the hip here, and I'm down here, this is very strong, the thighs are working very hard, and you have good support for the entire structure. We want to rotate into that hip, and we want to rotate passively into the hip. The left leg is driving and the right leg is receiving. That receiving is a passive thing. Here's another way I can kind of go wrong. So I said we don't want to sway to the side, we don't want to torque inwards, but we also don't want to rotate into this hip actively. That's also an error. We drive, and because this is relaxed, passively it rotates. It's not a question of I drive and aha, I know I'm supposed to rotate this hip, so I rotate it. No, this is a passive thing. This is the hip track because we're going from one extreme out here through this pathway, this track, to the other extreme. And it's the extremes of where the hips naturally rotate to. This hip naturally rotates to here. It doesn't rotate further. When we release, we'll find our way in the center. And then when we turn, we'll get to the other extreme here. So we get to the other end of the hip track. So the hip track is essentially this path that we take as we move through a stance. This is often studied in the context of the bow stance. So when I step out here into what we call a bow stance, I'm also looking at the hip track. The back part of the bow stance through the center of the bow stance to the front of the bow stance. When I come back, I'm just going to follow that same path back. But what am I doing here? Am I following that path? No. Now I'm twisting and torquing. When I start torquing and twisting in the ankles, all kind of things emerge. It's, in my view, incorrect to torque and then come forward, or to not rotate and then twist at the end. When I push down and into the ground, it causes me to rotate into this hip. The weight starts to transfer. When I keep pushing into this leg, I get rotated all the way to here. There's no reason why this shouldn't occupy a part of every Tai Chi class. This should always be part of the work. We can create simple exercises with hip track practice. Do a hip track practice that's in the horse stance, and we start from normal standing, step out comfortable, sink into the horse stance, drive to one side, come back, drive to the other side, come back. The stick can be very helpful in letting you see if the rotation is there or not. No rotation, or rotation inwards, so those would be errors. Now we're going to talk about stance types. There are, you could say, natural stances. We'll say primary stances. We're going to work with two stances, the horse stance and the bow stance. When we say this is the horse stance, it's because we have the idea that we're sitting on a horse, like riding a horse. The legs are open and they're kind of symmetrical. This is the kind of shape we see when we begin the form. We sink down into a horse stance. When we do cross hands and we shift from side to side. When we conclude the form. And it's something that we find in a lot of our Qigong or Neigong practices. We're moving up and down inside of a horse stance. The horse stance is used quite a lot. The other type of stance that's very common, it's used in a lot of forms or postures, is the bow stance. So this is the one that we see when we do our famous Hong, Yu, Chi, An. What are we doing here? We're doing a bow stance. I come forward for my ward off. Then when I come back to the center. I come back to the back of the stance. And from here, I have my press, center, forward. And so all of that is done in a bow stance. Other very famous movements, of course, are the brush knee. That's done in a bow stance. Part the wild horse's mane is done in a bow stance. Single whip is done in a bow stance. We're going to look at three basic variations of the bow stance. These comprise a big, probably 60-70% of all of the movements in Tai Chi. I'm going to stand essentially on two sides of this line when I make a bow stance. Depending on the kind of posture I'm supporting, the bow stance needs to take a different shape. For example, in the 5-section form, we do the first movement, standing here, turn, sink back, step out, and I do this movement, part the horse's mane. A moment later, we have step out and do brush knee left. Later in the form, we've got this movement called single whip. Notice that the relationship between my 2 feet, the stepping angle, changes depending on which variation of the bow stance I'm doing to support the posture. The bow stance operates on some kind of a spectrum. Let's start the spectrum from the horse stance here. If I go here, my forward direction is 0%. I don't have any forwardness in this horse stance, but it's 100% sideways. If I change the angle a little bit here and come forward, now we see that I've got about 15% forwardness in this leg and about 85% sidewaysness, sidewardness. If I go a little bit further, I'm about 50% of the stance is expressed as forward movement and about 50% is sideways movement. So the wide bow stance is short and wide, and then it gets longer and narrower and becomes the 50-50 stance. When we go a little bit further, you can see that it becomes even narrower still. It's about 85% forwardness and 15% sidewaysness. Now, these 3 variations of the bow stance support different kinds of postures. Part the horse's mane at the beginning of the form here. I'm opening to here. What I need is I need sideways support. Because the posture itself is moving sideways, I need this foot quite wide. Why? Because my action is going sideways. If I start to express energy more forward, then I need to open this back foot a little bit more and bring this foot in. And now we're doing something that's like push or brush knee, something like that. Now you can see that I've got good support sideways, but I've also got good support for the forward aspect of it. Once again, horse stance, good for cross hands, raised hands. A little bit open, 1585, and now we're doing part the horse's mane. We go a little bit further, and now we're doing 50-50, 50% forward, 50% sideways, and we're in brush knee. Now when we go a little bit further with the back foot, making the stance even narrower, we're into movements like single whip or fan through the back. And now we have a long, narrow stance. If we went further, we'd actually just create a horse stance in the other direction. Horse stance, and through these three variations of the bow stance, there's kind of a continuum. We go from very wide to a little bit narrower, stepping out to 50-50, to very long and narrow to a new horse stance. So this idea of primary stances and their continuum is something that we can think about as a core principle. When you're going through your Tai Chi form and you're thinking about how do I support this posture or this form, brush knee or fan through the back or single whip or part the horse's mane or fair maiden weaves at the shuttles, which of these steps belongs with that posture? Let's just take a quick look at what I would consider to be an error. This is a very common error when people are doing 24 movement Tai Chi or 5-section Tai Chi. We sink down, and when we turn, we step way out down the line here and then part the horse's mane. Well, you can see that's an error. It's not that my arms are really doing anything wrong. It's that my legs aren't supporting them. When my legs adjust and find the right position, suddenly now the arms are making sense. It's a difficult problem for beginners because what they see is they see the teacher with their arms like this, and they try to imitate it, and they don't know how to support what they're imitating. Another example of what I would consider to be an error, the 45-degree angle step, straightforward step here that we would use in push or in palm or in brush knee. And I was to do single whip that way. This would be, in my way of thinking, an error because the classical single whip, going all the way back to Shaolin martial arts and all the way through the evolution of Tai Chi, is a basically lateral technique. Classic Yang style sees it as something that faces forward with the head, but the body itself is really off to the diagonal. To put this kind of stance under it, very often what happens is people then start to do this like a palm push. That would be at least questionable. Maybe we won't say it's an error, but it's something to think about. There are some things to consider about the difference between a medium width bow stance and a narrow bow stance and a wide bow stance in terms of where the center of the stance is. In a 45-degree, 50-50 stance here, when we shift from one leg to the other, it's essentially right in the middle of the stance is the center of the stance. When you come back, you'll hit the center. You're no longer on the left side. There's the center. Now you're on the right side. That is actually a bit different if you're doing a wide stance. With the wide bow stance, the center of this is back towards this leg. And then it's all forward from that point. So this is consonant with the idea that we're going to do a lateral technique with a lot of support here. So we've got a little bitty side here and a big side here. Single whip kind of stances, the long narrow bow stances, are just the opposite. We've got a big open right side here. When we're going from this leg, this is open, 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 all the way from this right side, and then a little bit of a front side. Let's look at what we could call the secondary stances. These are secondary stances because they're not as fixed or defined as the primary stances. The connection between the 2 feet is a bit tentative. The most famous one, of course, is the shubu. That's the one we see in like play the guitar, the so-called empty stance, where this leg is very solid, but this leg is just barely weighted. This is called shubu, or empty stance. Could be translated into English also as false stance, because you're in a stationary position, it looks solid, but it's not. It can take off at any moment. So when you're doing, for example, play the guitar, this one can easily kick. One of the empty stance variations in this secondary type stance is with the heel. Another one is with the toe. White crane spreads its wings. This one's on the toe. Fist under elbow in traditional yang, or play the guitar that we find in all variations, that's on the heel. White crane, retreat to ride the tiger, high paddle horse, these are on the toe. This represents also a bit of a spectrum. So we were discussing the primary stance continuum, going from horse to wide bow to medium bow to narrow bow back to horse. There's a bit of a continuum here as well that goes from heel-oriented empty stance to toe-oriented empty stance to one-legged stance. We're on the heel, we come back with the toe, and then from here we've got the leg coming off the ground. So we go from heel to toe to one-legged stance. From here we could extend the idea, literally, by extending the free leg. This kind of step is called uli, or one-leg step. This step with an extended leg becomes our various kicks. Parting kick, kick the sole, rising kick, sweep the lotus kind of kicks. Those are all variations of the one-legged stance. The secondary stances are secondary partly because, as is implied by the name false stance, shubu, they're not quite as substantial as far as stances go as the primary stances. Another way you can think about them is on-the-move stances, transitional stances. There's a lot of relation between the idea of the empty stance and a step. So let's say, for example, I'm transitioning between 2 movements. I'm out here, I pick up the leg, I step out. Well, I'm not exactly in a posture here, but it's not that much different when I make this step here. One of the characteristics, as we've just seen, is that this can move. You can go from the empty stance, heel to the toe. There's a little bit of play there. And then there's that, and it could be a step. Secondary stances, we can understand them as being stance-like or stance-light, and that they have this additional characteristic of being able to move. Where we're at right here with this level 1 core principles concept, if you can master the stance concept, what the stances are, what they're for, how to move through the hip track, what is a primary stance, what's a secondary stance, what are the things that we're trying to keep in mind with things like stance proportion, then we'll be well on our way to practicing Tai Chi in a manner that supports the traditional art. If we get this stuff down clearly, then we'll be right on track to dive into the real traditional material. Well, first of all, we should acknowledge the past masters for the incredible gift that they've given us with this art. what they've passed down, what has evolved in the explorations of these, very unusual people. If you think about the intense fascination with this kind of stuff, a long legacy of very unusual people diving sincerely into themes and topics that are outside the normal sort of daily life concern. So I think a lot of acknowledgement needs to be given to those masters. They did their very best in terms of writing these things down and putting them into formulas, mostly formulas that we could understand or we could glean an understanding from. And of course, they passed down this unbelievable curriculum, just the solo forms and the inner work forms and the weapons forms and the partner forms. It's just a vast, vast treasure trove of, one genius insight after the other. When we're trying to approach all that, when we're trying to get into it ourselves, what we often find is some stumbling blocks in terms of language. How are we meant to, understand things like the 5 phases of the stance or something like that? If one really understands the 5 stance phases theory, then it's pretty clear and it's totally obvious how things have been constructed around it. But it's not enough to have in Tai Chi an intuitive grasp of it, or just a philosophical agreement with it. Let's say, for example, somebody wants to learn push hands, and they want to learn, this amazing art of connection. And the teacher reads them something from an old passage about the idea of sticking and adhering. For anybody that likes or loves or resonates with Tai Chi, they'll hear that and they'll go like, that's it. And we'll find ourselves nodding our heads to these things and then now go practice it. And one is left going, I don't know what to do. I just don't know where to start. So the reason why, for example, we would not dive immediately into the 5 stance phases when we're looking at the basic core principles, although 5 stance phases is a core concept, is that we need enough foundation so that we're not just agreeing philosophically. Our bodies can do it. Our bodies are conditioned to do it. So doing things like sinking into your stance correctly, standing up correctly, driving from the legs to stand up, creates the foundation for moving through the stance. It's not just that, we learned how to rise and sink, and now we just do whatever we want with the stance. No, it's actually built step by step on that foundation. Now, if we take the time, and we break it down, and we do these things in this way, and I mean really practice them. Get your favorite stick, maybe put some tape on the floor, and just shift back and forth and back and forth. Applying these things, being mindful of them, working on them, you'll have the foundation to really dig into this traditional material. When we're looking at the 50-50 stance, where it's 50% forward, 50% to the side, what we're looking at is the proportion of the stance. Something that's very important is that the numbers add up to 100. When I step out and I do my horse stance, it's 100% sideways, 0% forward. So 100 plus 0 is 100. When I do the wide bow stance, it's 85% wide and 15% forward. 85 plus 15 is 100. When I do this medium width bow stance, it's 50% about the width and it's 50% about the distance, about the medial length. 50 plus 50 is 100. And likewise with the single whip type stance, the narrow bow stance, long narrow bow stance, It's 85% long, 15% wide. There's another way we could look at these proportions too, and that's in terms of degrees. With the first step, we've gone forward no degrees, and we've stepped forward 90 degrees from where we're facing. If we were to look at the 15%, 85% kind of stance, the wide bow stance, we'd be looking at something that was, pardon the numbers here, that's about 17.5 degrees forward, 72.5 degrees wide. The next one is stepped out 45 degrees to the corner with the back leg at a 45 degree angle. And same thing here. We're 72.5 degrees and 17.5 degrees here. So we can think of this, when we're talking about, for example, a 50-50 stance where it's 50% wide and 50% long. What we've done is we've turned 45 degrees and stepped 45 degrees from there. So we have this, this 45 plus 45 equals 90, just like 0 plus 90 equals 90. So we can look at stance proportion in percentages or in degrees. When we're discussing these things, we'll go back and forth between the two languages. They both mean essentially the same thing. One other kind of way of looking at the properties of the stance is to look at the way things are weighted. If I'm doing a medium width bow stance, which can now be called a 50-50 stance or a 45 degree stance, however we want to describe that, when I'm doing this, I'm also cognizant of where my weight is. The stance could be back weighted, like in an empty stance, or it could be forward weighted. This forward weighted stance is about 70% of the weight is forward, bearing down on the front leg, and about 30% of the weight is taken up by the back leg. Or we could have something that's 100%. This is 100% taken up by the support leg, and 0% is taken up here. Often when we're looking at the weighting of the stance, we describe the weighted leg as the yang leg or the substantial leg, and the other as the yin leg or the insubstantial leg. There's different terms for this, and these are often described in percentages. So it's an 80-20 bow stance. When we're using language to describe what's going on, we'll mix between these various properties of stance, type of stance, weighting of stance. So you're doing brush knee, and what kind of a step is this? Oh, you step out 45 degrees, and it's halfway forward, halfway to the side, or it's a 50-50 stance, you can say that. It's 70% forward weighted, and it's a bow stance. What kind of a stance is it? It's a 70% forward weighted bow stance that's a medium width apart. This kind of way of thinking about stance, you want it to enter into your thinking as well. There's other ways to look at stance, like where is the stance oriented in the room? I could take this stance and move it 45 degrees. With that stance, I'm doing the same as the brush knee stance, but this arm is up and I'm off to this corner. So we could now say, I'm stepping out to the corner, doing a medium width bow stance with the weight about 70% forward, and that's the stance that supports my fair maiden moves at the shuttles. This kind of language, this kind of way of thinking, this kind of way of experiencing the stance, this is something you want to become progressively more and more hardwired in your thinking. Transitions. When we think of transitions, we're thinking about transitions from one stance to another stance. How to do transitions is a big subject, and it occupies a lot of basic training in Tai Chi classes. Probably the most obvious one is the movement from Gongbu to Gongbu. That's the one that teachers very, very often have their students practicing. What do I mean by Gongbu to Gongbu? That's bow stance to bow stance. I start out in a bow stance, and I somehow need to get to another bow stance, and then I somehow need to get to the next bow stance, as if I was somehow kind of walking through bow stances, like this. This brings us to a really interesting characteristic of stance work. It can be seen as a strength. It can also be seen by its critics as a weakness. And that is, when you're in a stance, you have no real momentum. So somehow you have to generate the momentum if you want to move. And critics of stance work would suggest that if you focus too much on stance work, you tend to get bogged down. You're not free to move. The mixed martial artists might have a problem with that, or the box. So some Chinese martial arts take the stance work into an extreme level of transition-based stance, things like bagua, where they're actually walking the entire time. In the beginning, when we're making transitions, it has a bit of a feeling of kind of plodding along, not very graciously. There are some disadvantages to moving this way. But these are all disadvantages that can be overcome and that can become advantages if we do the stance work correctly. These are things that can become real advantages. A couple simple basic things that we need to understand when we're doing any kind of stance transitioning. When there is no momentum, in other words, when you're not on the move, you're walking forward or back. When I walk forward, my feet can stay forward. And when I'm moving without momentum, they cannot do that. So let's say, for example, I've got my nice bow stance here. I've got this 45-degree angle here, this 45-degree angle here, and I want to go forward. Well, as it turns out, you need to have this angle in the back foot to support this foot. Whatever that angle is, if you're in a wide bow stance, this one has to be at an angle to this one. What would happen if I just stepped onto this leg and tried to walk forward? That's no good. That works fine if I've got momentum. That's not a problem. But if I'm stepping onto this leg and I want to go straight forward here, this is going to be very, very uncomfortable. So one of two things needs to happen. The very natural thing that happens if I get onto this leg and I just relax is that this leg now goes out onto this angle. I have my left foot forward, I put my weight on here, and what my leg wants to do now is find about a 45-degree angle here, which is great unless that's not where I want to go. Let's say, for example, this is of course very, very common, I want to step forward because I've just done part the horse's mane, and I want to do another part the horse's mane. Well, it's not going to work very well if I leave this foot where it is, and I step onto it and I try to step forward. Now I'm wobbly. I don't have any foundation from, even if I've got a nice wide base, it's still not stable, because this back one needs to be adjusted. 100% of people, not even 99.9% of people, but 100% of people, if they're instructed to step forward slowly like this, they will just naturally adjust that back foot. They'll make that adjustment just because this doesn't feel right. Somewhere along the line, I either need to step forward and adjust, or I need to somehow adjust before I step forward. And this is what generally happens when we're practicing Tai Chi, is that we make a transition of some sort. So we sink back, change angle, shift onto this leg. Now we can step out and voila. It's beautiful, it's forward, it's stable. And then if we want to go forward again, we have to repeat that procedure here. Somehow we need to change that foot. We have to get onto here, step out, and we're fine again. We get a problem if we try to walk forward slowly. It just doesn't work. I'm going to orient this way on the camera so you can see it. So this is going to become my back foot. the right foot. When I shift my weight onto this leg naturally wants to adjust. And that's what creates a lot of our transition. The fact that as soon as we get onto one leg, the body wants to move 45 degrees from there. You're talking to somebody you know, and as you're standing there, it becomes uncomfortable at some point to just stand on two legs. So you start, shifting your weight. So if you do this and the person's standing here, it'll be a bit funny. I'm talking to you on the other side of the camera, and when I shift my weight, I go here. So what I will want to do is, instead of leaving my foot here and letting my body turn to the weighted leg, I'm going to change the angle of my weighted leg. So I'm talking to you now. I'll take my back foot and I'll put it on an angle so I can continue to face you. So now we have a step like this. We started with a step like this. Chat, chat, chat. I want to maintain my discussion with you, so I shift my leg here and then I get tired of being on this leg, so I might shift it back again. So this is a completely natural phenomenon, the idea of adjusting the foot angle to orient to a certain direction. What we're really looking for is how to make the little subdivisions in between that allow us to smoothly transition from one body to another body. So let's say, for example, I'm in the medium width bow stance. That's the standard way that this gets practiced. Of course, you can practice it with the wide bow stance as well. It's a little bit different with the narrow bow stance, but that's for another day. So I've done my brush knee or my partner versus main or my palm and forward. Now I'm going to come back, and I'm going to come back exactly as I would if I was just moving through the hip track. So we remember, we drive forward, then we release. This back hip starts to receive and rotate. We find the center. That means that there's some weight on this leg and there's some weight on this leg. But what we want to do is now lift up the toe. It is possible. Some people do this. They go all the way back, which makes it much easier to lift the foot. But then it tends to cause them to twist the ankle. So what we're going to do here is come back in the hip track right to center. Then from here, lift the toe. Don't try to turn, don't try to move anything, just lift the toe. Now, when you've lifted the toe, this hip joint is going to swivel. And you put the foot down, and then you just let everything relax, and it will find a new orientation, and you start folding into this hip. Now, because the legs are a bit splayed apart, it's difficult to really get into this hip. So at some point, the back heel lifts off the ground. And you start driving first off the ball of the foot, then the toe. From here, it's a good idea to turn the waist, the ribs a little bit. And this is going to allow you to draw this foot in. And then now you can step up, almost like an empty stance. From here, you treat it like you have just driven back here in your hip track. You put that foot down, release, down into the center of the stance, drive forward. Coming back, same thing. So you come back to the center, lift the toe, turn the leg independently, release, start lifting the heel, driving the ball and the toe of the foot. From here, turn the waist, turn the ribs. From here now, step out. From here, release the waist, release and into the hips. One more stance transition is shubu to gongbu. So shubu, we were talking about the empty stance, the idea that the empty stance could be an empty stance on the heel, or it could be an empty stance on the toe. If you're already in an empty stance and you want to step out, it's difficult to just put the foot out. There's energy built up because of the toe being pulled back. There's energy built up in the shin here, in this area. And it's difficult to make a step when that tension is there. You pretty much need to relax the front of the leg, draw back, and then from here you can step out into your bone stance. That's quite different than, say, trying to maintain this and step out. Okay, let's say we have an empty stance and we're going to step into a boat stance from here. Same idea, you just draw the leg back, it's already closer to the position, and then you step and move on. So that's a way to move from Shubu to Gongbu. From Gongbu to Shubu, we have a few of these in the form, in different forms. You're already forward on this leg. Gongbu to Shubu means you have to somehow, see this line here, you have to make the stance narrower because our final Shubu position is going to be with the feet close together. So how are we going to do that? If my stance is here, my heel and my toe are roughly aligned, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my back foot onto the line, my heel here, and bring it up in line with the front foot, the back of the front foot, and step in here. Gongbu, half step up, means I might need to rotate a little bit more into this leg in order to bring this foot up. Then from here, let it relax, back into this hip. And it could go to the toe step or the heel step. We can also have Shubu to Shubu, or empty stance to empty stance. This is kind of a quasi-Shubu when we do repulse like monkey. So it's not a full-on heel or toe step, although some people do it that way. My teacher, Liang Shouyu, when he does repulse like monkey in the 24, he does it with an actual empty stance with the toe. But it's usually a slight variation of the empty stance. We're back on the back leg already. That's why we can say it's an empty stance. When we open up, we let the body orient to the direction of the back leg. The back leg toe is going this direction. And I'm going to let my face, you can't see it right now, but I'm going to let my face and body go to this direction, open up, and then all at once release the leg, the torso, everything, step back, and then let the foot unfold or unwind into position. Most of the balance problems here are really as a result of timing issues. So when you come back, head is back, draw in. Now when you make the step, careful to let the upper body go with the lower body. If I'm doing my repulse like monkey kind of movement here, everything's open, the leg is in, and when I step back at the same time, I'm going to release, especially right here, release everything together, and that's going to allow me to move from empty stance, back, again, everything oriented to the support foot, step back, and let everything go into empty stance. So a direct transition means I'm going from my Duli Bu, I'm going from my one-legged stance directly into my Gongbu. Or I'm going from one Gongbu into the next Gongbu. There's another kind of transition which we usually experience as a turn body transition. For example, so a turn body transition is we're in a bow stance, doing a push, and we're going to turn, sink back, and transition all the way to a bow stance on the other side. So we've got the language now. What am I doing here? I'm doing a medium width bow stance, 50-50 for my on. When I turn, I'm shifting, changing the angle, coming back. And what am I doing? I'm doing a long, narrow bow stance here for my single width. That's an example of an indirect transition. Another very obvious one would be, for example, the large turn in Fairmaiden Works, the shuttles, the ones we see in the traditional. So we're actually going to sink back, turn. There's quite a bit going on here, stepping out. And this indirect transition takes us from one bow stance to another bow stance, but with a 270-degree turn. Oh, I guess the most extreme one is here. Retreat, you ride the tiger, turn to a one-legged stance that takes us into a bow stance, or actually a half-horse stance. Movements like that require a lot of transition study. We've looked at what is a stance. The stances create the possibility for exploring forms, powers, energies, transitions, movements. The stances are the foundation for all of that. We've looked at the hip track. The hip track is something that needs to be there through all of the movement, staying in the structure. We've looked at the idea of stance proportion, the idea that you should step out only as far as your leg allows you based on the support leg's bend. We've looked at types of stances, and while we didn't do an exhaustive study of all Tai Chi stances, what we have done tonight probably covers about 75% of stance work, at least in Yang style Tai Chi. So we looked at the idea of primary stances. What are the primary stances? The horse stance and the bow stance. With the bow stance, we looked at it in 3 variations. So the wide bow stance, the medium bow stance, the narrow bow stance. Then we looked at the secondary stances. So secondary stances are ones that are not quite as established. They usually have one foot that could be described as empty. In fact, the first one is the empty stance, the shubu. We looked at the idea that the shubu, the empty stance, could be performed with the heel of the unweighted leg or the toe of the unweighted leg. We talked a little bit about the idea of the weighting of the stance. So the idea that you could have a 100% zero stance, like in a kick. With the weighting of the stance, we could also have a 50-50 stance that's like the horse stance, or a 70-30 stance. Weighting of the stance, the percentage of step out versus rotation in the back leg. The idea that a long, narrow stance is 15% wide and 85% long. These stance properties, combined with stance type, all of these things come together to form the properties of the stance. Then there's also this idea of transition, moving from gongbu to gongbu, or shubu to shubu, or shubu to gongbu, or gongbu to shubu, or moving from one-legged stance into an empty stance, or so on and so on. These are all types of transitions. If you want to be methodical about your practice, you can take the transitions that are there in the forms, pull them out, pull them apart, and using these core principle ideas, devise exercises and practices. Thank you very much. I hope that gave you lots to think about and gives you lots to practice.
Thank you, everybody.